Hello and welcome to this month's episode of Sci Cam, the online science show. I'm Michael Conterio, and joining me this week is Sonja Dunbar. Hello, Sonja.
Hello!
Hello. So I'm going to be kicking things off this week with a discussion about how quantum physics could be used potentially to stop some credit card fraud. This is something that came out just before Christmas. Researchers have basically come up with a protocol for making sure that people can't clone your card and use it like that. Because all of the cards at the moment, they're the magnetic strips, which are actually quite easy to take details off. People can put card skimmers in front of ATMs. People can basically do that sort of thing subtly. And even the chip and pin devices, people can sort of duplicate the chips inside them, and then they basically have a copy of your card and can use it to do whatever they will. Whereas the idea with this is that you make something which is very, very difficult to copy, and in this case it would be a little reflective patch with some reflective nanoparticles in it, and these would just be kind of effectively randomly scattered onto this patch while the card was being manufactured. And because this is random, it's going to be basically impossible for the people to copy it. And then the way that you'll actually prove that you have this card is a pattern of light will be shone down onto this reflective patch. That will get reflected back, and then the bank will have actually already done this sort of thing lots and lots of times with lots and lots of different patterns of light in order to work out what the answer should be. And so because you need the card there to reflect it, people without the card won't be able to send the right answer back that the bank is expecting. But you might be wondering, what happens if they just measure the light coming in? What if they've just measured the card in the same way that the bank has? And the trick here is that we have to use quantum physics in order to make this secure. And so the idea here is we can use very, very weak light pulses. So they only have what we call a few photons, a few particles of light in them. And these photons can behave quite strangely to us when we're used to what we call the classical world, lots of big things, lots of light coming at us at once, all that sort of stuff. Whereas when you get down to individual photons, you get to the point where you can't even really say where the photon is, where the light is actually coming from. You get this pattern which is actually a quantum object rather than something we're used to. And the thing about these quantum objects is that if you try to measure them, you actually disturb the pattern. So if you try and measure the light which is coming in towards your card, then you'll destroy the pattern. You might get a little bit of information about it, but you'd have to keep measuring the same pattern over and over again in order to get a full idea of what was actually sent. And the banks aren't going to do that. They're just going to send one pattern and check it at a time, and then they'll send a different pattern and check it. And they can have hundreds of these patterns, and just your little bit of measurement isn't going to give you any idea of which of these hundreds it really is. It's almost like they're sending a secret password to your card in the form of light. And the card, through its reflective properties, will automatically send the right password back. But if you try to measure either of these, then you will in fact destroy the password. It's like a set of password and code words with its own self-destruct sequence. So if the bank sends the light down perhaps an optical fiber, bounces off the card and comes back with the correct answer, then they know that the card was physically present. Of course, there are still some problems. If you were just creating the light and shining that inside the shop, then of course you've got the same problem as you might have with normal credit card transactions, in that you can have what is called a man-in-the-middle attack. So someone could basically stop the transaction. They can read it there, and then if it's not encrypted properly, they can basically pretend to be the bank. They can send a question to your card, get an answer, and then when the bank sends this, if it's just going down a normal cable, then it's not this quantum light. It's only secure while it's in this quantum light formation. And then someone will be able to basically fake stuff to the bank. So you'd have to set up an awful lot of optical fibers going from banks to all of the shops, which probably isn't feasible. But if they're careful enough and set up other kind of cryptography between the bank and the shop, then that should be pretty good. And at least you know that swiping someone's card and copying a magnetic strip isn't going to be a method of attack anymore. So there you go. The quantum weirdness, light, very weak, you're not being able to clone it, you're not being able to copy it, and you're not being able to measure it without disturbing it, could lead to secure credit card transactions with a lot of infrastructure. And remember, if you've got any questions about any of this, if you're on our YouTube page or our Google Plus event page, just type in a comment and we'll try and answer it during the show if it happens during the show, and if it happens after the show, then we'll hopefully try and get back to you at some point soon as well. Sonja, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. So, this week I'm going to be talking about a case of parasites and hosts. And a few years ago, researchers reported a parasitic wasp species that laid its eggs in ladybirds and manipulated the behavior of the ladybird to protect the developing wasp. So the way this works is that once the eggs have been laid in the ladybird, they hatch into a larva, and that larva grows inside the ladybird until it's time for it to pupate. And at this point, it actually leaves the ladybird's body, and it forms this pupa on the surface of a plant where the ladybird is walking, and develops into an adult wasp. The curious thing about this, though, is that the ladybird, even though it's now free of the wasp at this point, stays paralyzed over the top of the wasp pupa, and it protects the wasp pupa by giving it cover and also by flicking its wings in a sort of deterrent manner, which startles any predators that might be interested in eating either it or the wasp. The big question from that study a few years ago really was why? And today I'm going to continue the story thanks to the findings of a paper that was published last week, this one, in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. And a group of researchers collaborating across several institutes in France and Canada have discovered that there is a third player in this tale, and it's a virus. They've named this virus Dinocampus cochineae paralysis virus, or DCPV, and the Dinocampus cochineae part comes from the name of the wasp that transmits it. To find the virus, the group analyzed RNA, so genetic information, in samples of both ladybird and wasp larvae at different stages of infection. One particularly interesting thing about their analysis was that it suggested that adult wasps have a very small population of the virus in them, and it's not reproducing. Whereas in growing larvae in a ladybird, there's actually a very high level of viral replication. And that's quite unusual for the sort of virus that this is. Normally, they'd replicate a lot in the adult female wasp to be injected at a very high number. That's the opposite of what's happening here. And while there still needs to be more research into this, it potentially means that actually this virus isn't very detrimental to the wasp at all. So what is it doing? Does it have an effect on the ladybirds? And the way they looked at this was using transmission electron microscopy. So they cut very thin slices of either parts of the ladybird or parts of the wasp larvae, looked at them with the microscope, and were actually able to observe changes in the ladybird's neural system as the infection stage progressed. So the important change was when the larvae left the ladybird. Up until then, not much was going on. They were able to see the virus particles in some of the cells associated with the nervous system, but there weren't any major changes in the nervous system cells themselves. But when the when the larva left the ladybird, the neurons in the ladybird's brain were seen to degenerate. Cells lysed, and the nervous system was effectively quite destroyed. Not completely, but to a large extent. Additionally, all those virus particles that I said that were seen largely built up not in neurons, but in a different type of nerve cell, which are known as glial cells. They're not neurons at all. They're actually more supportive cells. Their name comes from the Greek word for glue. They sort of stick the nervous system together and keep it running. And these cells, too, were seen to be destroyed and affected by a change that occurred at the point that the larva left the ladybird. The interesting thing about the effect on these glial cells is that in insects, at least, they also happen to play a really important role in locomotion. And so the destruction of these cells would be an explanation for the paralysis that you see in these ladybirds that turn into the bodyguards of the wasps. The tremors caused by the ladybirds flicking their wings can also be explained by this damage to the nervous system. But there's an upside. It's in fact not all bad news at all. The cell destruction, known as autophagy, is actually a key feature of the antiviral immune defense. This brain damage is actually being caused by the ladybird to itself, because its immune system has finally had chance to respond to the presence of the virus that's built up inside it. Now, you'd think that doesn't sound like a great response, paralyzing yourself. And indeed, it's not great. And the reason that the ladybird hasn't responded sooner was that the presence of the wasp larvae actually suppresses its immune system. It doesn't get chance to respond at an earlier stage. So when it finally does have that relieval of suppression, when the larvae leaves, its response is somewhat devastating. But once the cells are destroyed and the virus removed, the nerve cells can actually be restored. About 25% of the ladybirds that people have seen actually survive this crazy ordeal, which I think is rather impressive. So this paper was a really interesting example of some quite complex control of hosts by pathogens. But it's not the only example of such complex control. If you've been with us since the start of Sci Cam, in the second episode you might remember that I talked about a parasite that infected mouse brains and made them respond differently to the presence of cats, namely making them more likely to become a cat's lunch. There have been some other examples since then, including a fungus commonly known as the zombie ant fungus, which infects ants, and in the particular species that it's supposed to parasitize, it causes the ant to bite down on plant material, and it'll then die there anchored to the plant while the fungus grows, and it's happy because it's elevated from the ground, perfect to spread its spores and infect more ants. There are even parasitic worms that do a very similar thing. There's a type that infects grasshoppers. No grasshopper in its right mind would willingly jump into water. But when infected by these worms, that's exactly what they do. Why? Again, because the next stage in that parasite's life cycle needs to be in the water. So all of these strategies that I've just spoken about have a net benefit towards the reproduction of the parasite, and the cycle goes on. It's, well, I might say a dog-eat-dog world, but I think probably fungus-eat-ant world is more appropriate here. Back to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Sonja. So obviously there's a lot of interplay going on. You've got the ladybirds, the virus, and the wasps, and obviously the wasps carrying this virus to the ladybird ending up paralyzed. It's amazing to think just how that must have developed over such a long time scale, just that all those things just came together, all those animals, well, animals and viruses, I guess, in order to create something which is really good for the wasp, I guess.
Yeah, and it's often very specific because another study back when they first found this sort of parasitism of the wasp and the ladybird discovered that actually it tends to disproportionately affect certain species of ladybird. And in the UK, it targeted our native ladybirds, and one of the invaders, called the harlequin ladybird, was completely resistant to it. So these tend to be very specific host-pathogen relationships. And it's the case with the zombie ant fungus as well. It won't trigger chemical release in the wrong species of ant. So it's very clever. Much like your credit card idea. Well, not your idea, but your explanation.
It's interesting because the idea of not being able to measure a quantum state without destroying it is also a key thing in quantum cryptography, which is kind of a way of basically it's easy to like exchange secrets if you've got a key that's long enough, because you can just use that key to encrypt your message before you send it. And if you shared the key beforehand when you're both in the same place, that's not a problem. But quantum cryptography relies on this change when you measure a quantum state, and the fact that you can't always get all the information out of what the state was when you measure it, to basically show if there's anyone eavesdropping when you're creating this key over a long distance. And if anyone's eavesdropping, you just go, yeah, not using that bit, just get rid of that. And obviously it's a different sort of quantum communication going on here with the credit card, but the kind of like idea behind it is kind of the same as this no cloning theorem, which is a bit of quantum physics as well, which says that you can't copy a quantum system, which if you could, it'd be great, because you can just copy it and then you can do all your own measurements on it. You can make loads of it and keep on measuring it in lots of different ways, and that way you'll actually be able to extract all the information about it. Because that's the thing, you don't know the best way of measuring it almost. That's the thing in the quantum state. And if you measure it a different way, then you just get a random answer, effectively. And without that, but if you knew what the state was beforehand, then so you could measure it right, then you're not, yeah, then basically you already kind of mostly know what you're going to measure, so you can't get any more information out that way either. It sounds
quite promising, because I imagine that perhaps you could even, like, you'd know if somebody had attempted to tamper with it as well. You might not be able to track them, but you should know that something has interfered. Whereas that's often a problem with people, being unaware of these huge, like, credit card fraud things, because people don't act to shut things down because they just don't know it's happened.
Yeah, of course there are still loads of different ways that people could commit credit card fraud, mainly involving nicking someone's card and using it before they've noticed they've lost it. And yeah, hacking the banks, doing that sort of thing. Every time you've got a human in there, I guess that's technically sort of a weak spot for secret communications. We're often quite bad at keeping secrets.
We're saying that humans are a source of scientific error, huh?
Yeah.
I think that's pretty reasonable.
Anyway, thank you very much. I hope everyone's enjoyed this. If you've got any questions about what we've been talking about, stick them in the comments on the Google Plus page or the YouTube page for this video. We'll be back again next month, but we're doing something a bit different, because we're putting on a live show as part of the Cambridge Science Festival, and this year it's somewhere a little bit bigger, so hopefully we'll have a bigger live audience. But it does mean that we can't get a decent internet connection from there. So it'll be the first pre-recorded Sci Cam show, and that will go up on our Google Plus and YouTube accounts, hopefully not too long after it's actually filmed. So something a bit new. Hopefully all the microphones will come out right. As well as possibly causing errors in science, humans are also good at causing errors in recording technology. But we hope you join us back here for that. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.